This is Dave Stanton for Carbatec. Welcome to our video on the BS-345H 1.5 horsepower 14-inch bandsaw. When opening the package, locate all of the items and check through to ensure that everything is there and you haven't thrown anything out with the packaging. First, assemble the stand using the 1/4-inch carriage bolts, nuts and washers. Fit the legs to the stand on the outside of the horizontal rails, top and intermediate. The short top rails on the end of the stand are fitted above the longer rails on the side of the stand. This will align the holes in the top of the stand to accept the bolts that anchor the saw to the stand. Finger tighten the bolts on the stand at this stage and apply the rubber feet. Put the stand on a level surface and adjust until it is symmetrical to evenly distribute the saw's weight, and then tighten all of the nuts with the spanner supplied. Insert the 4 stand-to-machine base attachment bolts through the top of the stand from the underside and secure with the small washer and nut from the top, and then tighten. The stand is now ready to accept the saw body. You can place the bandsaw on top of the stand, aligning the bolts with the holes in the bottom of the bandsaw. Do this prior to assembling and placing the saw's workpiece table. The bandsaw is heavy, so you will need assistance at this stage. When the bandsaw is on top of the stand, fit a washer and a nut to each of the 4 connecting bolts and then tighten. Connect the top section of the trunnion to the underside of the workpiece table using the 4 hex head bolts and lock washers provided. Fit the leveling bolt to the table at the same time, and slide the table from the back of the bandsaw around the blade until the 2 parts of the trunnion align, and drop the connecting bolt through the bottom section of the trunnion. Tighten the wing nut. Personally, I found the easiest way to mount the table on the bandsaw is to first mesh the top section of the trunnion onto the bottom section of the trunnion, pushing the connecting bolt through the bottom hole and tightening the wing nut, locking the trunnion in the horizontal position. This is before the table comes near the saw. Remove the insert from the workpiece table and slide the table from the back of the bandsaw around the blade until the holes in the trunnion line up with the holes in the underside of the table. Have a couple of the hex head bolts and lock washers ready to fasten this part when it's in position. Insert each of the bolts through the trunnion into the underside of the table, but do not tighten yet. You'll notice that one of the bolts will be awkward to get to. Release the wing nut on the trunnion and tilt the saw up to 45 degrees. This will expose the 4th bolt location, and then retighten the trunnion wing nut. Fit the last trunnion bolt to the underside of the table. While the table is at 45 degrees, this is when I fit the limiting stop bolt, which has a lock nut as well. Lower the table back down to 0 degrees, where you can adjust the limiting stop bolt so that it's just touching the saw body, and then tighten the lock nut using the 13mm spanner supplied. The insert can now be replaced. There are adjustment bolts where the trunnion is mounted to the body of the saw. These allow you to move the table east and west in relation to the blade and the table insert. The bolts that hold the table to the trunnion are also to be relaxed, giving you a small degree of adjustability in this area to maintain a parallel cut. Don't forget to retighten these bolts after the adjustment. Next thing to do is place the rear support for the rip fence. There are 2 machine screws and washers to fit to the steel angle to the rear of the workpiece table. Ensure the angle has the flat section to the top, not to the bottom of the table. You'll notice also that the angle will hang out to the left-hand side of the table as you are standing in front of the bandsaw. Fit the 4 wing bolts across the underside of the front of the table, but only by a few turns. Do not tighten. Slide the front rail for the rip fence, aligning with those bolt holes that support the rail, and push it against the table, leaving the gap between the rail and the table, which is predetermined by the profile. Tighten the 4 bolts. There will be a slight amount of adjustment available with those bolts. The rip fence can now be put in position. Slightly relax the 4 wing bolts under the table. Place the cursor on the rip fence over the 0 mark on the graduated scale and push down on the rip fence clamp to lock in position. Move the rail left or right so that the fence is just touching the left-hand side of the blade. Tighten the wing bolts. The front rail serves two purposes. One, as we've just discussed, and another is to keep both sides of the table's blade access slot on one flat plane. There is also a small adjustment screw to the left-hand side at the 350mm mark on the graduated scale. This is for fine tuning. You'll notice also that the rib fence is designed to hook over the rear rail, not to ride on top of it. This is to resist the fence lifting up as you tighten the front clamp of the rib fence. Fit the drive belt adjustment's crank handle. Ensure the bolt section of the crank does not come past the body of the saw, thus enabling the crank to be turned a full 360 degrees. There is a screwdriver slot in the front of the bolt which will assist you in holding the bolt section steady as you tighten the nuts. The top and bottom inspection doors open independently of each other and are both fitted with micro switches for safety, which disables the machine when the doors are open. Fit the blade tensioning knob on the top of the body of the saw. Before starting the saw for the first time or after fitting a blade to the saw, you will need to adjust the height of the top set of blade guides to the optimal height for the workpiece to be cut. First, support the assembly with one hand and then undo the clamp on the right-hand side of the machine with your other hand. When the assembly is the correct height, retighten the clamp. You'll notice that the blade guard automatically adjusts itself during this time. Relax all of the blade guide bearings prior to adjusting them to their correct position. Be sure that the side blade guide bearings are behind the gullets in the blade and that the bearings are only just kissing the blade, both sides, and that the thrust race behind is also just missing, so they are not turning when there is no load forced against the blade. Do this for the top guides and also for the bottom guides. You may want to tilt the saw's table up at 45 degrees to have better access to the lower guides down here. The whole assembly that holds the guides in position is able to be advanced forwards and backwards depending on the size of the blade fitted. The thrust races are able to be adjusted individually. When adjusting the side blade guides, there are small handles that you can hold the guides and position them by first relaxing the internal recess hex screw on the face of the bearing guides and then tighten when in the correct position. The saw comes to you with a speed setting of 900 meters a minute, which is correct for cutting timber. With a non-ferrous metal cutting blade fitted and the V-belt in the slow speed pulley gearing position, the blade will turn at 440 meters a minute. To change the speed of the machine for the purpose of cutting timber to non-ferrous metal, first ensure the power is disconnected. Open the door to the bottom wheel, and as you do, push the dust collecting guard on top of the door to the horizontal position. Completely relax the belt tension pulley by turning the crank in a clockwise motion. Move the flat multi-V-belt to the front pulley on both the motor and the bandsaw wheel. You must have the V-belt corresponding slots in the correct position on both of those pulleys. Retension the drive belt and close the door, ensuring the dust guard is raised up again as it approaches the door's closed position, and lock the door. To tension the blade, turn the knob on top of the saw body in a clockwise direction. To adjust the tracking, we'll have a look up the top here. Slowly rotating the top wheel by hand, observe how the blade is tracking. Ideally, we want the blade to be tracking on the middle of the wheel's tire. Release the wing nut on the back of the saw's top panel and turn the knob clockwise. This will force the blade to advance to the rear of the tire. Counterclockwise if you desire the blade to come to the front of the tire. Once you have the blade in the correct tracking position, tighten the lock wing nut and then reposition the thrust races to their correct places. Note that the bottom wheel is factory set but is able to be adjusted by the 4 bolts. This is not advisable as the first option to blade tracking correction though. There is a 4-inch dust port at the bottom of the body of the saw. Connect a dust extractor that is capable of a minimum of 20 meters per second airflow.